Welcome to the Grid Mod Pod, brought to you by AEIC. In this podcast, you'll hear from the utility industry's top operations leaders on how their companies are working to modernize and improve our ever-evolving power grid. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome back to another episode of the Grid Mod Pod. I'm very excited about today. We're doing somewhat of a sub-series on the Grid Mod Pod where we're bringing on some champions and innovative leaders within the utility, like always, but really to share particular projects that we deemed awardees in our AEIC annual award event. And so today we have our presidential awardee, Robert, which I'll allow him to introduce himself and look forward to diving into this project and discussing, what the challenge was, what the solution is, and where we're going next. So with that, over to you.
Thanks, Liz. First of all, thank you for having us on your podcast. We're very excited. We were so honored to receive the AEIC President's Award this year. My name is Bob Wargo. I'm the Senior Director of the NERC Center of Excellence here at NextEra Energy. And my role is to make sure that we stay compliant to all of the NERC standards, both the operations and planning standards, as well as the cybersecurity SIP standards. And as you know, Liz, that has been a challenge over the last 15, 16, 17 years. We always had the sense that we were chasing compliance. And until we really brought forward this innovation, we didn't really feel like we had it licked, so to speak.
Right.
And, this innovation really has allowed us to get ahead of compliance and feel very comfortable about our performance in that area.
Yeah, and just for our listeners, one thing, when I reviewed the awardee, but then I got to meet Bob before jumping on here, I was in a role where, I was the senior manager of transmission and distribution planning. First coming into the transmission was my first love. I was an outsider for 12 years, and then I became an insider of a utility where I learned about this compliance culture that has been brewing and developing really since, 2005 around the Energy Policy Act. So, when we think about, what it is like to work in a utility, you truly don't understand it until you're a part of that transmission compliance team. So I was excited to see the attachment of innovation and this really novel, effective work that you're here to share. So I was geeking out with Bob before this call, so I'll try to tame down my excitement. But innovation and compliance typically isn't two words that you mix. And so I think this is a great opportunity to share that it is possible. So for our listeners, really in the essence, like what problem? Also remember, we want to also boil it down a little bit for some of those that don't understand this transmission realm. But what problems were you trying to solve with this project, and why did it matter at this moment and you kind of alluded to it, but for the community as a whole?
Compliance is always the hidden task that has to be accomplished, but nobody really appreciates how much effort it takes to be fully compliant. And the problem we were trying to solve was at NextEra Energy, we need to perform over 2 million tasks every year perfectly, successfully, in order to be fully compliant. So if you think about a couple million tasks a year, just being able to document and validate that you're in a full state of compliance, it takes a Herculean effort when you're doing it manually. And as most companies do, we really never truly knew whether we were compliant unless we had an audit. And typically this cycle is every 3 years or so you're audited. You get hundreds of SMEs, subject matter experts, together to put together evidence packages. And the only time you ever see a complete set of evidence is when you're handing it to the auditor. Well, that's not a good time to have your evidence package together. So what we challenged ourselves was, can we build a system that we can instantaneously have all records of compliance available at our fingertips? And so really the initial problem we were trying to solve was, how do we audit ourselves every day like auditors audit us every 3 years? And that really got the innovation juices flowing, and people started talking about all the data we had. And we had so much data dispersed throughout all the business units. We had all the essential data we needed to put together for that picture, but we needed a system to do that.
Right. And I guess just because this is a kind of a newer realm for the podcast, when we think about the grid, I love to really, there was understanding where we were, where we are, where we're headed, and then where we ought to be, especially during this transformational time where technology and the exasperation of available data, not that the data didn't exist, but now we have systems that can extract, transfer, cleanse, and produce. Before that, like pre 1965, like this idea that our grid grew organically and it was through voluntary coordination, like peer norms, engineering judgment. So it was a very engineer led decision making space. And then, we did have, I think it was, in that time period, a blackout, which, wrote a lot of history, a lot of stem from it. And then there's great history, probably enough time to talk about. Then in 2003, we had another Northeast blackout, which then created the body NERC, North American Electric Reliability Coordination entity. They more or less had the ability to create enforceable standards, which means there's monetary fines if one was deemed, not perfectly executing said conglomerate of transmission assets. So with that, it really grew a culture, and you were just speaking to it, of like, it wasn't as if these things were not happening, but this enormous weight was placed on the entities that own these assets to really be able to publish their procedures, ensure that all of the touch points are effectively occurring. And, the body of work was relying on self-reporting and really professional accountability. So like in that is a whole realm of just a new body of work and personnel. And so what you just shared is that, with that, when you have an enormous set of fleet, there's an enormous amount of data that is being studied, understood, and connected by people. And so how do you streamline these processes is kind of the essence where we're sitting.
Yeah,
There's my
yeah,
history lesson for my podcast.
yeah, absolutely. It's not only having that data available, but how do you use separate pieces of data to cross-validate? Typical compliance programs operate in silos. So if you're doing a cyber asset management task, you're separate from the operations tasks that are being performed on that device. Well, there's an opportunity if you have those data sets available to you and you have it organized. Now you can cross-validate. Is something missing? Is something not occurring when it should? Is the device being used in the way you think it's being used? Data is the key to all that. And once you have the data, and we'll probably talk about data and data quality and data cleansing, but once you have the data organized, cleaned, and contextualized, that cross-validation can occur.
Yeah. So, and then thinking about, if anyone listens to the grid mod on a repeat, a big part of it is desiloing the silos within the utility space. The way the grid has ran, there's a reason and a purpose and a complexity to it. And now with all of these new available resources and exasperation of assets that are all talking to each other, this has been compounding. So I guess, thinking about where your journey started on this particular project, like how did you and your team approach from concept, and then like talk about a little bit about the overall execution, kind of timelines and obstacles and stuff
Sure.
like that?
Sure. It's been an interesting journey. We started about 4 years ago. I think the traditional approach has always been get everybody on the same platform, using the same system, doing things the same way. Well, that's never going to work in any company of any size, especially a company that's as diverse as NextEra Energy. We have generation assets, transmission assets. We have just a great IT group. To get everybody using the same system just doesn't make sense. It wouldn't be practical for the business units to do that. So we took a different approach. We said everybody can keep their source system. And we identified over 200 source systems. So these are systems that might do a cybersecurity task. It might do an operations task. It might do a physical security task. But what we told everybody, you can keep your source system. What we're going to do is we're going to identify essential relevant data that lies in your system. And we want access to it to pull that into a data aggregator. And once we identified where the data lives, what source system it houses it, then we could start working with the business unit to say, hey, you don't need to do anything different. You just need to give us access to the data. And once we brought that in, and as I said, Liz, really the end goal was to have a full audit picture 24/7. And the data that we were pulling in would demonstrate whether we were fully compliant to all our tasks. Well, once we started that journey where we had the data aggregator model idea, we identified the source systems, we started bringing the data in. Then the last step or the next step would be, what validation rules do we put on top of this data aggregator to tell us whether the information that we're receiving constitutes full compliance or is good evidence as well. That's where two worlds collided. We started this project before AI was really anything. And we just started this data aggregator because it made a lot of common sense. But as the AI tools started to develop, we saw, wow, we could use AI, number one, to speed up our development and deployment process by helping us with writing code and building rule sets. But it would also provide us with machine learning capabilities where we can seed some validation rules in it inherently, but then it begins to learn other validation. You can make a connection between data that sits in one system to another data field in another system, and would identify anomalies or off normal conditions. Maybe the AI would not be smart enough to understand exactly what was occurring, but it would raise its hand and say, hey, you need to look here. Out of all these millions of tasks, here are the handful that you should be concerned about. And then you could have the human look to see what is actually occurring. So those two worlds, our data aggregation model and the AI tool sets, really collided at the perfect time.
And so a couple, one, I think a big takeaway and a thread that I would love to weave in almost every conversation I have is, that awareness of like, okay, you all have your source systems. They all have their flaws and they have their perfections and they have, the way you do things entrapped. And so when we think about a lot of hesitation to move forward, the conversations I hear is like, well, our data isn't cleansed, our data isn't accurate. But the key here is that you keep your data as is, provide us an awareness of what data is actually utilized for this particular process, which sounds really simple and not right and basic, but like having how many players? 200 sources, so many
Yeah.
players, earn own a certain subset of that system, and just getting them all on the same page and understanding how to communicate effectively of like what pieces of data are important. And then you said just kind of saying it, giving access to that data, which is a lift, but it doesn't mean it's not doable. And I guess after you have that is when you develop the tools, the models, the algorithms, the validation process, which is, I wouldn't say basic coding, but like fundamental ways of like making data talk to each other and reproduce results, right? Reproduce results. And so I guess in that feedback, and maybe I'm just asking this to you, like you learn that what changes and validations need to occur to actually then start altering and or confirming the 200 source systems, right? So like they can evolve as you identify, through your, I guess sandbox, I don't know what you guys call it, but a space where you put all that accessible data, right? And there's just great power in that. So when you're able to do that, which you said it, like governance and, overseeing of that extraction of data, then allowed you to run this type of.
And you talked about, the business unit or the source system group of SMEs. How do they buy into this? I think the other key was we were help them solve a problem. And, you're familiar, Liz, with all the NERC standards and how much data there is. And it's really a challenge to keep that data accurate and clean. And I think if we think about like facility ratings, FAC 8.
I was gonna say, I don't know all about fact 8.
Yeah. So
Life changing.
that's been an industry struggle in order for us to stay compliant to it 100% of the time. And if you look at the history of FAC 8 compliance across the industry, a company will have an issue And then they'll do a walk down of 100% of their facilities. So they'll walk down the transmission line. They'll see what wave traps are on it, what devices on it, what ratings are on it. And when they're done with their 100% walk down, they have clean data and it's accurate. The problem is, a year goes by, 2 years goes by, 3 years goes by, and all of a sudden their data is not accurate as it was because things change, things are restored, things are replaced. Well, that's been a challenge. So as we bring it into the NIC, the NERC Information Command Center, we can
Great
validate.
acronym.
Great. Yeah, we love NIC. And we'll talk about AVA in a second, but we'll talk about NIC first. But when we bring it in, we sure that it's clean, and we can tell that subject matter experts where we have suspect data fields. Hey, these dozen data points seem to be inaccurate or inconsistent. And, then we clean it. But then you have the rules about what clean data should look like. So as the system evolves, we check the accuracy of the data as it's being created. So you don't have the cycle of having to walk down your facilities every 3 years in order to achieve clean data.
And
We
just for our
address pain
listeners,
points for the subject matter experts.
I guess it's just for our listeners, you say walk down. So just to kind of visualize what that means. I mean, you have physical people. I don't know what other type of people you have, but trucks. You have work orders, right? You have execution plans for these crews to roll out to the physical assets and confirm, when you're doing like a self-audit or just kind of a review and maintenance and inspection process, which then, categorizes said pieces of data into a database, right? And so like when you're walking down, you're actually like physically walking down assets, which, if everyone knows, transmission assets are vast and sparse across your facilities of lines and then also the substation. So it's actually like a very, I don't know what the word is, not cumbersome, but it takes
Yeah.
resources and time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very labor intensive and it's very slow. Takes a long time to do it. And, I've been involved in NERC compliance for close to 20 years. I was first on the regulator side of things. So I got to see a lot of, FAC 8 issues across the industry. And that cycle of walk down, correcting the data, and then having that data slowly erode in terms of accuracy. That's the way it's been across our industry. And, I think bringing that information into the NIC provides us with another layer of validation of that information such that we can keep that data set from straying too far from being entirely accurate.
Right. So thinking about Nick, and then I guess you kind of alluded or foreshadowed towards Ava, but so what from that activity of like, okay, concept, really draw out, understand the amount of processes, getting the buy-in from your users, which really was simple. Keep it simple. You're here to help, truly. And, what outcome or impact stood out to you once, you're able to, put this in production and see value? What was expected and unexpected from the achievement?
Yeah. So you remember this journey. We started this journey. We wanted to be audit ready. We wanted to be continuously audit ready. We've been audited over the years. We're NextEra Energy. Anywhere in our company portfolio, we're probably being audited continuously several times a year by different regions. We're actually in all 6 regions. So we have a very good view in terms of, from a regional entity, the NERC regional entity, what they're expecting. But when we started back in 21, a typical audit on the SIP side would take a couple hundred SMEs, 6 or 8 weeks to put that initial evidence package together. Now with the NEC,
Let's just pause.
Yeah.
To do a particular audit. So not just the audit, a particular audit.
Yeah.
Required a couple hundred SMEs to take a break from their day-to-day job to be able to provide the relevant information and content to deliver said package. 6 to 8
Yes.
weeks.
Yes.
That's a lot
Now,
of love.
yeah. Now, and that's pretty typical across the industry.
Right. It
Mhm.
did. Yeah.
So now that we connected to all the source systems, now that we had automated validation, Now that we built in evidence packaging, we could generate the evidence for a SIP audit by a push of a button with a zero SME involvement. And then the SMEs would only be called upon during the audit week to
So,
attest to and to talk about the evidence. They would not have to put it together and validate it.
so like if we did, there'd be a mic drop there. I mean, you said SIP. So this is a SIP audit, which, is a very complex, protected, right, set of a space. So the fact that you're able to implement this innovative solution in this protected data space, I mean, is of itself powerful. So just you
Yeah.
like so that advancement. So that was more like when you went into this, that wasn't like the expectations. Like, hey, we could take 200 SMEs, 6 to 8 weeks of their time, and right, that wasn't your original like, let's do this. Right? It was really, let's understand our processes and see how we could be audit ready. So I
Yeah.
think it's
Yeah.
a beautiful story. So
Yeah, absolutely. And manage the risk of an audit. When you don't have a complete set of evidence until it's time for audit, you don't really have a lot of time to look for secondary backup evidence if the primary evidence is missing with our system now. And I talked about AVA, and AVA is
right, I
our
was gonna say,
AI enabled virtual auditor. So we have Nick and we have Ava. We're
wait,
equal
is there a
opportunity
cool acronym behind AVA, or just
AI enabled virtual
AVA?
auditor.
Oh, okay, AVA. Oh, that's even okay.
So, and she runs and she puts the evidence together and validates it and highlights any anomalies, any off normal conditions, highlights any work in progress. So, we talked about the evidence package. We talked about, packaging the evidence at the time of task completion. But now Ava and the Nick have worked its way back into work in progress.
Mm.
So because we have visibility into the underlying processes that are being executed to complete the compliance task, we can look for anomalies in the work in progress. So things like a ticket that is going back for rework multiple times, or a task that is stuck in a certain gate, or a task that doesn't seem to have, the correct information, or it's operating on wrong information. So we could get ahead of a non-compliance, and we could help the SMEs and say, hey, we see you struggling with this task. We're here to help you. Here's the missing information, or you have a ticket that's stuck in a rework loop. We can help you get it out of that rework loop. We can connect people across the different business units. So really, it's moved from, yes, we want to be good for audits. Now we want to perform the task without having issues.
Right, which so is kind of that feedback loop I spoke of. So like you have your source systems, you allowed those to exist as is, started this process, then you started seeing, okay, now how, instead of just being always completed and ready, like how do you tap into that feedback loop so that you can, you know, raise flags or alarms or anything to say this, needs to be looked at in real time, like in progress. I love it. And like if you think about like going back to like where we've been, where we are, this compliance culture that exists. I mean, fundamentally, you know, the blackouts really just brought awareness to the larger public, like the larger public, that you know you have this massive grid that's all interconnected, and so are the players effectively having full situational awareness. I mean, at the essence of it, of these assets, how they perform and how they will perform, and preparing that reliability and that resiliency. But along that discussion, I think there's like phases where utilities had to adapt, like always have been engineer driven, like reliable. Like a goal is to keep the system stable. And it's why the grid has been as reliable as it's been. And so compliance or accountability or authority over specific asset groups was almost good operations, like best practices, kind of like that volunteer organization. And so there wasn't, like, I would say, like maybe minimal documentation because everyone kind of had their job and understood how it all worked. And so then came this compliance, this audit ready, really explosion of procedures, evidence, checklists, really the separation between operations and a compliance team, which was of value. And then the last part, which you just brought in, is this management of risk. So now you kind of created with Ava a space to like bring those two worlds together so you're effectively, working cohesively, really, right? So you're kind of effectively helping those that have always been operating the grid. Hence, just I think it's incredibly valuable, and just the realization that this can be possible, right? If you have the right focus with the end goal in mind. See, can you tell I'm excited? So, I mean, now you have, Nick in place. You kind of have the teammates and those that are you're helping kind of vetted and like, oh, this is effective. What's next for this effort, and how do you see expanding some of this work throughout your world?
Liz, I talked about, this project and AI coming together at like a beautiful moment in time. And the key to AI is to have clean data, have available data, have data that is contextualized, understanding the environment in terms of validation rules. Where we see the future now is on the execution of compliance tasks, looking at the 80% of the task that is drudgery, that is kind of turn the crank, repetitive. You're
Dim
going,
the lights.
seeking the information, you're looking at the information, you're analyzing it, and then you're acting on it. And all that happens the same way every time. And so the question becomes, why do you have humans doing that 80% drudgery part of the task? You want them to concentrate on the 20% that takes analytics and thinking and reasoning and decision making. So now that we have the system where data is available, we see the in-process workflow. Now we can start giving the SMEs some AI agents or task helpers to do that 80% drudgery to get the information to them that they need at the time of making decisions.
So one, I love the word drudgery because, like, if for those of you who have been in this world, it is very monotonous and very like meticulous. Which, thinking about like workforce development and recruitment and enablement of said bodies, there's only a particular thread of talent that really like thrives in that space. They're greatly needed, but right, this could help simplify and remove. And I guess you know there all is this concern that AI will like eliminate jobs, but I think the more of us thought leaders in this space, that 20% that requires, that additional perspective and human insight of actually understanding the grid's performance is incredibly valuable and can be, expanded to a much larger degree. To deter the fear of like, well, it's removing 8% of my work product, but it's like this grid is complex and is transforming every day. So we need, to unlock that human potential. Would you agree? I guess I'm kind of
Oh,
just saying it.
oh yeah, absolutely. And I told you that I was part of the regulator side of the house for a long time. And I saw, thousands of issues across the entire electric utility industry. And almost every one of those non-compliance happened in the drudgery part of the task. When the humans were fully engaged, they very rarely made the wrong decision. But it was putting together the 80% of drudgery, background, evidence, and information where people had problems. Just because it's so labor intensive, so many details, and so repetitive and high volume, it's hard to get that perfect. Well, that's where AI is a lot better than humans.
Yes. And I think, AI, it's not going to replace the human judgment. It's removing that weight that prevents that human judgment to show up, because especially if you make that like maybe fat finger thumb mistake or just something like very iterative and simple, but it can snowball into a very large amount of operators being pulled in, planners being pulled in, engineers being pulled in, all over like a manual data pool that created maybe duplicative documentation that you're trying to like understand, okay, which one, right? I mean, something as simple as that can really lead to the wearing of that human who maybe was at fault and maybe doesn't want to continue in that space. And then you just lost like a high commodity of a
Yeah.
talented potential leader.
Yeah. Especially when you're expected to be perfect. It's hard
Yes.
for people to be perfect. And, just one miss is a non-compliance.
Right. And a lot comes from that. So,
Yeah.
so I guess, and you kind of shared throughout today, but what my last question is, knowing the space you're in and all this vast experience that you have, for those peers of yours or maybe operators that are hesitant to say the compliance group is here to help, what's some word of wisdom or something to give, to kind of latch onto of, what to do next or how to like maybe get over that hurdle?
I think, that the key is that you can deliver value very quickly. A lot of times we look at tackling something this big and say, well, it's going to be multi-year. It's going to be a lot of money. You're going to have to get a lot of buy-in from a lot of people. But, with the tools that we have today, you can make a difference almost immediately. Many of the accomplishments we had were a function of, 6 or 8 week sprints where we delivered functionality within 6 or 8 weeks just by helping people with their data and then, organizing the aggregation of their data in a way that is an immediate help to them. And what happens is when you start doing that across your compliance environment, it starts to add up very quickly. And now you have critical mass. Now you can tie all these systems together. And now you could provide functionality that people only dreamed of. And that's what we did here at NextEra.
I love it. So your message is get started today.
It started today, yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And I look forward to hearing more about how you guys take these AVA and maybe some other fun acronyms into your NIC in the future. So it was very nice to meet you, Bob. And I look forward to transforming this industry together.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, Liz.
That's a wrap for this week's episode of the Grid Mod Pod. Thanks for tuning in. We hope today's conversation got you thinking about new and creative ways to improve our power grid. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to hear new episodes. This podcast is brought to you by AEIC, the place where operations leaders come together to share knowledge and provide guidance to the electric utility industry. We'll be back with a new episode soon. Until then, keep powering on.